In the dimly lit streets of Kiev, there's a name whispered among those who operate in the shadows, a name that, though barely known outside of Ukraine, carries an almost mythical weight within the criminal underworld: Viktor "Shadow Ledger" Petrov. To the untrained eye, Petrov was just another face among the crowd, blending effortlessly into the daily life of the city. But beneath that calm exterior lay a mind as sharp as a blade, and a figure whose rise to power in the chaotic days following the collapse of the Soviet Union would become the stuff of whispered legends. What made Petrov different from the countless other men who sought control of the underworld? What drove him to orchestrate one of the most elusive criminal empires in the post-Soviet world? And why, despite the countless people around him who would have wanted him dead, did he remain a phantom, seemingly untouchable, living in the shadows but controlling everything from behind the scenes? To understand Petrov's extraordinary rise, we must first step back in time to a world on the brink of unimaginable change. The early 1990s in Ukraine were marked by the crumbling of a once mighty empire. The Soviet Union, long a powerful force, was in its death throes, and the collapse left behind a fractured and unstable political landscape. For many, the fall of the Soviet Union was a time of hope, an opportunity for freedom, for a fresh start. But for those like Petrov, it was an opportunity for something much darker: power. In this new world, the streets of Kiev, once tightly controlled by Soviet law and order, were suddenly a battlefield for control. Political leaders scrambled to fill the vacuum, and organized crime surged, filling the spaces left behind by a weakened state. It was here, in the heart of this anarchy, that Petrov saw his chance. But while many of the aspiring mob bosses in Ukraine saw power in brute force and violence, Petrov understood the true nature of control: information. From a young age, Petrov had been different. He was never one to raise his voice or make himself the center of attention. Quiet, calculating, and precise, he was a man of few words and even fewer gestures. But behind those cold eyes was a mind that took in everything around him. In a time of chaos, when information was power, Petrov's ability to see the bigger picture made him a force to be reckoned with. While others rushed to seize power through reckless violence, Petrov worked in the shadows, building relationships, gathering information, and most importantly, creating a network. He wasn't a gangster in the traditional sense. He was a strategist, a mastermind who knew that to build an empire, one needed more than just muscle. Petrov understood that, to survive in this dangerous world, he had to play the game quietly, methodically. He would need to establish connections with politicians, businessmen, and other criminal figures. He would need to weave his influence into every corner of Kiev without ever exposing himself to danger. What few people knew was that Petrov's rise was marked not only by his strategic genius but also by a deeply ingrained sense of self-preservation. He didn't crave fame or recognition. He didn't seek glory. What he sought was control. And he understood that control came through anonymity, through blending into the shadows, and by keeping his true nature hidden from the world. As the years went by, Petrov's influence continued to grow. The public saw him as just another businessman, a quiet, polite man who rarely made waves. But in the criminal world, he was becoming something far more significant. He was becoming the unseen hand that moved everything behind the scenes. No deal was made without his approval. No shipment of weapons, no illegal business transaction, could go forward without Petrov's consent. Despite his growing power, he remained an enigma, a ghost. His name, though whispered in circles of power, was never tied to anything specific. There were rumors, of course, rumors that he had orchestrated this or that he had a hand in some major crime. But nothing concrete. Nothing that could be used to take him down. Petrov's ability to remain hidden in plain sight became the cornerstone of his empire. He was a ghost in the system, operating under the radar of law enforcement, politicians, and even rival gangs. His empire wasn't built on violence alone, it was built on subtlety, strategy, and control of information. Petrov understood that in the modern world, it wasn't enough to be feared, you had to be respected, but above all, you had to be invisible. But how did a man who operated entirely from the shadows manage to build such a powerful empire in a time of chaos? And why, after all his success, did Petrov continue to avoid the limelight? What was it that kept him in the shadows, out of reach of even his closest allies? The answer, perhaps, lies in Petrov's greatest secret, his ledger. His shadow ledger was not just a record of names, dates, and transactions, it was a map of power, a meticulous document that kept track of everything that was happening in the criminal world. This ledger, carefully hidden and encrypted, held the keys to everything Petrov controlled. It was the blueprint of his empire, a silent guide that allowed him to remain one step ahead of everyone else. With this ledger, Petrov knew who owed favors, who could be trusted, and who was planning to betray him. He knew where every criminal operation was taking place and who was involved in each. His ability to manage these interconnected webs of influence gave him a power that few could even comprehend. Yet, even with all his power and influence, Petrov remained a mystery. His name became synonymous with control, but his face never appeared on the front pages of newspapers. He was never arrested, never publicly linked to any major criminal activity. Instead, he became something like a legend, a figure whose existence was debated but whose power was undeniable. In the quiet moments of the night, when Kiev's streets were empty and the world seemed at rest, Petrov's empire quietly thrived in the darkness. The power he held, the influence he wielded, was almost invisible, yet, it was absolute. And so, the story of Victor Shadow Ledger Petrov unfolds in the shadows, a tale of quiet dominance, of a man who rose from the chaos of a broken nation to become one of the most powerful figures in the criminal world. But as with all tales of power, this one too would be marked by betrayal, danger, and the relentless pursuit of control. What came next would change everything, and, as we will see, not even Petrov's carefully constructed empire could protect him from the dangers lurking in the shadows. Viktor Petrov's early life is a story of contrasts, set against the backdrop of a Soviet Ukraine that was struggling to find its identity in the aftermath of war and revolution. Born in the late 1950s, Petrov grew up in a country still reeling from the scars of World War II, where the past was often swept under the rug, and the future seemed uncertain. His childhood was marked by a profound sense of quiet hardship, yet the streets of his hometown in Ukraine offered something more than just the promise of survival, they offered an education in the ways of power. His family, like most in the Soviet Union, was not wealthy, nor were they part of any political elite. They were ordinary people, struggling to make ends meet in an era defined by shortages and rigid government control. Petrov's father worked tirelessly as a factory laborer, while his mother, a woman of few words but intense resilience, kept the household together. They were people who lived by rules they didn't question, following a daily routine dictated by the state. Yet, for young Viktor, the monotony of Soviet life never held much appeal. From an early age, Petrov displayed a keen intellect that set him apart. Though quiet and introspective, he had a mind that could analyze, calculate, and predict with an uncanny accuracy. He watched his father, the stoic laborer, and realized that the real power in the world wasn't in the sweat of one's brow, it was in the ability to navigate the system, to understand how things work beneath the surface. His curiosity was insatiable, and this thirst for understanding led him to explore every corner of the world around him. At school, Petrov was often seen as reserved, even aloof. While the other children dreamed of careers as doctors or engineers, Petrov's thoughts were elsewhere. He had a fascination with the mechanics of power, the way people gained it, held it, and, most importantly, lost it. His teachers noticed his quiet intelligence but often mistook it for mere shyness. Little did they know that it was the early signs of a mind that would soon come to dominate the darker corners of Ukrainian society. The streets of his neighborhood were, for Petrov, the true classroom. He observed the way people interacted, how alliances were formed and broken in the blink of an eye, and how survival often depended on the ability to make the right connections. His classmates were often the sons and daughters of factory workers or government bureaucrats, but Petrov's closest companions were the children of local petty criminals, men who existed just outside the reach of law enforcement but were well versed in the games of power and manipulation. These were the men who would, in time, become his first teachers. As a teenager, Petrov started spending more time in the company of these figures. He watched how they bargained, how they demanded respect, how they used subtlety to win what they wanted. He realized that in the world of the criminal, nothing was ever straightforward, every move was calculated, every word measured. Power wasn't just about strength or wealth, it was about understanding the delicate balance of control and trust. Petrov learned early that there was no room for error in the game of survival. His life on the streets of Kiev was a world away from the carefully controlled and censored world that the Soviet government tried to maintain. By the time Petrov was a young man, the social and political fabric of Ukraine was beginning to tear at the seams. The Soviet Union, once an unshakable empire, was crumbling, and with it, the iron grip that the government had on its people. As the state began to weaken, opportunities began to open for those willing to take risks. And Petrov, already a keen observer of human nature, was ready to capitalize on those opportunities. The turning point in Petrov's life came when he was about 18. The streets of Kiev, once a place of mundane survival, were suddenly filled with the energy of possibility. The Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse, and as the power of the state faded, the streets became ripe for something else to take root: organized crime. Petrov, who had spent his youth studying the ebb and flow of power, saw this as the chance he had been waiting for. But Petrov wasn't interested in being just another thug or enforcer. He wasn't drawn to the violence or the chaos that often came with criminal life. Instead, he saw a different path, one that required subtlety, patience, and a deep understanding of the systems around him. In those early days, while many of his peers joined local gangs or engaged in petty theft, Petrov began to form a different kind of connection, one based on trust and intelligence, not force. He quickly realized that to rise above the street-level chaos, he would need more than just street smarts. He would need access to information, and in a city like Kiev, where everything seemed to be controlled by corrupt officials and military officers, that information was invaluable. He started to cultivate relationships with people in power, those who held the keys to the inner workings of the local economy, the state-run industries, and the criminal networks that were beginning to thrive in the wake of the Soviet collapse. But this wasn't just about making friends in high places. Petrov knew that power was fleeting, and that the more you were seen, the more you became vulnerable. Instead, he chose to remain a shadow, a figure who operated behind the scenes, pulling strings and making moves without ever revealing himself. He began to see that the true power in this new world was not in wealth or muscle but in information and influence, the ability to make things happen without ever getting your hands dirty. By the time he was in his early 20s, Petrov had already made a name for himself in the underworld. He wasn't a leader in the traditional sense, but he had developed an intricate web of contacts, each of whom owed him a favor. He wasn't a man who would fight for power with brute force, he was a man who would broker it, control it, and use it to manipulate those around him. His ability to remain in the background while building a network of influence made him an invaluable ally to those seeking to navigate the shifting political and criminal landscape. Petrov's rise was a quiet one, unremarkable on the surface, but deeply effective. He had learned early that to make it in this world, he had to think long-term, to build connections that would last beyond the moment of immediate gratification. And as the 1980s gave way to the chaos of the early 1990s, Petrov was poised to step into the void left by the crumbling Soviet state, ready to carve out his own empire, not with violence, but with the power of information and subtle manipulation. In those early days, Petrov's ambitions were still taking shape. He wasn't yet the feared figure that he would later become. But the foundations for his empire were being laid in the shadows of Kiev, and it was only a matter of time before those around him would come to realize that the quiet, calculating young man they knew was a force to be reckoned with. Petrov understood, as few did, that in the world of power, silence spoke louder than any gunshot. Viktor Petrov's transformation from a quiet observer of power to an active participant in Kiev's criminal underworld did not happen overnight. It was a slow, deliberate process, marked by calculated risks and careful alliances. Petrov, even in his youth, understood that success in the criminal world didn't come from rushing into the fray. It was about positioning oneself in the right place, at the right time, and, most crucially, with the right connections. And while many young men in his position were eager to prove themselves through acts of violence or sheer audacity, Petrov knew that the key to his success would lie in his ability to plan, to wait, and to act only when the moment was right. In the early days, as the Soviet Union began to unravel, the streets of Kiev were a cauldron of opportunity and danger. The state, once a powerful and omnipresent force, was slowly collapsing, and with it, the laws and institutions that had kept order. In the vacuum left by the crumbling bureaucracy, various factions of organized crime began to assert their dominance. But unlike many of the men who rushed into the fray with guns drawn, Petrov watched and waited. He saw the rising tensions between the various gangs, each fighting for control over territory, resources, and power. Petrov, however, had a unique advantage. He wasn't bound by the same rules or limitations that most criminals followed. He wasn't interested in controlling the streets or in petty turf wars. Instead, he was interested in something more elusive: information. In the chaotic environment of early 1990s Ukraine, where every politician, businessman, and criminal was scrambling to carve out their own slice of power, Petrov saw a way to manipulate the situation without ever needing to expose himself. His early criminal activities weren't defined by violence, but by quiet influence, behind-the-scenes maneuvering, and the careful accumulation of leverage. One of the first steps in Petrov's rise was aligning himself with the right people. In a world where loyalties were easily broken and power was constantly shifting, Petrov understood the importance of building a network of influential contacts. He sought out individuals who held power in their hands: corrupt politicians, wealthy businessmen, and even high-ranking military officers. These men were the gatekeepers of resources, and by gaining their trust, Petrov could begin to weave himself into the fabric of the city's criminal elite. Petrov didn't approach these men with bravado or force; instead, he relied on his natural charm and his ability to listen. He understood that power didn't always have to be asserted; sometimes, it was enough to quietly observe and offer the right words at the right moment. Over time, he became known not for his physical presence, but for his uncanny ability to predict outcomes, to offer solutions to problems others hadn't even considered, and to create opportunities where none existed. He wasn't just a man of action, he was a man of ideas, of foresight, and of precision. As Petrov's influence began to grow, so did the risks. His quiet methods, though effective, attracted the attention of those who worked in more overt ways. Rival gangs began to notice him, and some grew wary of his ability to slip through their fingers unnoticed. But Petrov had already begun to build his own network of allies, men who owed him favors, men who trusted him and would protect him when the time came. These were the men who would help him navigate the increasingly dangerous waters of Kiev's criminal underworld, ensuring that he could continue to operate from the shadows, unseen and untouchable. But Petrov's rise wasn't without its challenges. As his network expanded, so did the number of people who saw him as a threat. Petrov had learned early on that in the world of organized crime, nothing was ever truly secure. Betrayal was always lurking around the corner, and the lines between friend and foe were often blurred. The city's criminal elite was full of men who were hungry for power, and Petrov was quickly becoming a significant player on their radar. There were close calls, times when Petrov's life hung in the balance. One such incident occurred when a rival gang leader, seeing Petrov's growing influence, decided to make an example of him. The gang leader had heard whispers of Petrov's quiet control over the criminal activities in Kiev, and he saw the young man as a threat to his own dominance. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting with a group of local businessmen, Petrov found himself ambushed by a group of armed men in a dark alley. The gang leader had sent them with a simple order: eliminate the shadowy figure who had begun to exert influence over their turf. But Petrov was ready. His ability to read situations and people was his greatest asset, and he had learned to trust his instincts. Just moments before the attack, he had noticed the subtle signs of a trap: a too silent street, the wrong men standing near the exit. Without hesitation, Petrov slipped away into the night, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. The gang that had planned to kill him was left frustrated, never knowing how close they had come to eliminating one of the city's most elusive figures. This close call marked a turning point for Petrov. He realized that, while his methods had served him well so far, he needed to become even more cautious. His name was now becoming known, and with that came greater risks. Petrov's influence in Kiev's criminal world was growing, and so too was the target on his back. But rather than retreating, he doubled down on his strategy of invisibility. He didn't need to flaunt his power, he just needed to ensure that no one could ever trace it back to him. Petrov's rise continued in this manner, quiet, measured, and, above all, strategic. While others fought for dominance in the streets, Petrov was already thinking several moves ahead. He understood the shifting political and economic landscape of Ukraine better than anyone, and he used this knowledge to secure positions of power in places that others had overlooked. He wasn't just a part of the criminal world, he was quietly shaping it from within, laying the groundwork for an empire that would be built not on violence, but on information, trust, and the unseen connections that would make him untouchable. By the mid-1990s, Viktor Petrov had become a name to be feared, though few could say they had ever seen him. His empire was vast, his influence immeasurable. But even as he stood at the threshold of what seemed to be unlimited power, Petrov remained an enigma, a man who had mastered the art of disappearing even as he controlled everything in his wake. By the mid-1990s, the landscape of Kiev had transformed into a battleground where power, wealth, and survival were determined by more than just muscle or brute force. It was a time when the old Soviet system was falling apart, and the streets were filled with new opportunities that Viktor Petrov had been quietly preparing for. The Soviet collapse had left a void, and into that void had stepped a new breed of criminal, men who understood not just how to control the streets, but how to manipulate entire industries, governments, and economies. Petrov, now in his 30s, was no longer just a shadow figure pulling strings behind the scenes. His influence had grown to such a degree that he was beginning to take a more active role in Kiev's underworld. But he still refused to engage in the traditional ways of crime that most of his peers relied on: violence, extortion, and intimidation. Instead, Petrov's power was rooted in his deep understanding of the shifting political landscape and the growing role of organized crime in the country's economic transformation. The fall of the Soviet Union had opened up unprecedented opportunities for individuals like Petrov, who had the foresight to see the changing tides. While many of his contemporaries were scrambling for control over the street-level rackets, drug trade, prostitution, and smuggling, Petrov's focus was on something far more lucrative: the privatization of state assets. The Ukrainian government was selling off state-owned industries, and with the right connections, these industries could be acquired for pennies on the dollar. Petrov, through a web of intermediaries, was quickly becoming one of the key players in this new form of criminal enterprise. The process of privatization was chaotic and often corrupt, with government officials pocketing bribes and turning a blind eye to shady deals. Petrov knew that in this environment, success wasn't about who had the most muscle, it was about who controlled the flow of information and could move the right pieces on the chessboard. It wasn't long before he had woven himself into the fabric of Ukraine's new business elite, all the while remaining a silent partner behind the scenes. One of Petrov's first major moves came when he set his sights on the Ukrainian oil and gas industry, a sector ripe for exploitation. The state-run oil companies were being sold off to private investors, and the government's lack of oversight meant that nearly anything could be bought. Petrov didn't have the financial backing of the major oligarchs, but he had something they didn't: access. Through his network of politicians, businessmen, and military officials, Petrov was able to broker deals that would allow him to acquire a substantial share of the country's energy resources, often without ever putting his name on paper. At the same time, Petrov was developing his influence in the world of finance. Banks and financial institutions, once tightly controlled by the state, were now in the hands of private individuals and groups. But the system was still in its infancy, and many of the new financial players were inexperienced, often relying on brute force or intimidation to get their way. Petrov, with his calculated approach, saw an opportunity to integrate himself into this world without attracting undue attention. He quietly began to invest in several key financial institutions, using these banks as tools to launder money and facilitate more lucrative deals. As his financial empire began to grow, so did his reach. Petrov didn't limit himself to the traditional criminal underworld, he was branching out into the realm of legitimate business, where the real money could be made. His investments spread across a variety of industries, from construction to telecommunications to the burgeoning tech sector. But, as always, he remained in the background, ensuring that his name was never publicly associated with any of the companies or deals. Petrov understood that in a world where everyone was hungry for power, the best way to survive was to never be seen as the one holding the reins. Despite his careful maneuvering, Petrov's rise didn't go unnoticed. His influence was growing too fast, and as with all men who rise too quickly, there were those who began to feel threatened by him. Rival gangs, former allies, and even members of the government began to take notice of his quiet ascent. Petrov's name had begun to circulate in hushed tones, and it wasn't long before he found himself the target of several attempts on his life. The first real attempt came in 1996, when Petrov was traveling through the outskirts of Kiev. His car, a nondescript black sedan, was ambushed by a group of gunmen. The attack was swift and brutal, bullets riddled the vehicle, leaving it almost unrecognizable. But Petrov, ever the strategist, had anticipated the possibility of such an attack. He had been tipped off by one of his many sources within the local police force. The ambush, while deadly in intent, failed. Petrov was unharmed, but the attack sent a clear message: the game had changed, and Petrov was no longer operating in the shadows without risk. After the failed assassination attempt, Petrov knew he had to adjust his methods. The quiet, behind-the-scenes approach that had worked so well for him in the past was no longer enough. He had to make a statement, without revealing himself too openly. He began to expand his network of loyal enforcers, men who would do his bidding without question, and he set up a series of safe houses throughout Kiev. These safe houses were equipped with the latest security measures and served as Petrov's sanctuaries from the growing threats around him. He also began to work more closely with a group of former KGB officers who had gone into private security, using their expertise to protect him and his operations. Even as the threats against him escalated, Petrov continued to build his empire. He knew that, ultimately, his survival would depend not on his ability to fight, but on his ability to outlast those who tried to destroy him. And so, he did what he did best: he adapted. He learned from his mistakes and used the lessons from his close calls to refine his strategy. His wealth continued to grow, and with it, his power, though now, it came at a cost. Petrov had entered a world where enemies were everywhere, and loyalty could be bought, but never guaranteed. Despite the constant danger that now surrounded him, Petrov remained calm, always calculating, always thinking ahead. He had a singular focus: to consolidate his position and ensure that no one could ever topple him from the top. He had already carved out a space for himself in the Ukrainian underworld and business world, but he knew that to truly control everything, he needed to expand his reach even further. It was clear to Petrov now that his empire had grown too large to be contained within the confines of Kiev. He had begun to set his sights on new territories, regions of Ukraine and beyond, where the same opportunities existed, and where he could continue to expand his criminal and business networks. But this, he knew, would be his greatest challenge yet. The stakes were higher than ever, and the game was becoming more dangerous by the day. As Viktor Petrov's influence continued to grow, so did the complexity of his operations. His ability to stay in the shadows, moving silently through the corridors of power, was now his greatest asset. But with power came enemies, rivals who wanted to take his place, politicians looking to cut him down, and businessmen desperate to control the territory he had claimed. Petrov, however, had learned the art of survival long ago. He understood that in a world driven by violence and betrayal, the key to dominance wasn't just physical strength, it was foresight, patience, and control over information. The year 1997 would prove to be a pivotal one in Petrov's rise. By this time, his influence had spread across multiple industries: construction, energy, finance, and telecommunications. He had become a shadow ruler in Ukraine, pulling strings behind the scenes, often without anyone realizing just how deep his grip had extended. But despite his strategic brilliance, there were those who were beginning to notice his growing reach and power, and they weren't content to simply let him be. One of his most formidable adversaries came in the form of Andrei Makarov, a rising star in the Ukrainian political landscape. Makarov, a former KGB officer turned oligarch, had his sights set on controlling the country's resources. He had connections in both the political and business worlds and, unlike Petrov, he wasn't willing to operate in the shadows. Makarov believed that power should be flaunted, not hidden. He wanted to take control of the resources that Petrov had quietly amassed over the years, and he wasn't going to stop until he had done so. Makarov had tried to buy off some of Petrov's key allies, hoping to erode his power from within. But Petrov, ever the strategist, had anticipated this move. He had already planted loyalists in key positions, individuals who had no price and who would never betray him, no matter how much money Makarov offered. This only fueled Makarov's anger, and soon, the conflict between the two men escalated. What had started as a quiet rivalry was now turning into an open war, a war where Petrov's power and life were at risk. To counter Makarov's moves, Petrov began to use his greatest weapon, information. He had always been skilled at gathering intel and using it to his advantage, but now, the stakes were higher than ever. Petrov began to quietly infiltrate Makarov's network, planting moles within his businesses, his political campaigns, and even within his family. Through these moles, Petrov gained access to Makarov's plans, his weaknesses, and most importantly, his intentions. One of the first pieces of critical information Petrov obtained came from a high-ranking government official who was secretly working for Makarov. This official, under the guise of a public meeting, had slipped some documents into Petrov's hands that outlined Makarov's plans to take over several key state-owned industries, including a series of lucrative energy deals. Petrov immediately saw the potential threat: if Makarov succeeded in these acquisitions, he would control much of the country's resources, making Petrov's influence obsolete. Petrov, however, was always 2 steps ahead. He used the information he had gathered to begin subtly undermining Makarov's efforts. Petrov didn't engage in direct confrontation, that wasn't his style. Instead, he used his network of corrupt officials, businessmen, and financiers to create delays, expose flaws in Makarov's plans, and plant seeds of doubt in the minds of Makarov's allies. Each small action compounded over time, gradually eroding Makarov's position. In one particular case, Petrov orchestrated the collapse of a critical business venture that Makarov had been relying on to fund his expansion. Through a series of well-placed rumors, strategic leaks to the media, and the manipulation of financial documents, Petrov caused the stock price of Makarov's company to plummet. It was a subtle attack, nothing overt, but devastating nonetheless. Within weeks, Makarov's investors began to pull out, and the venture collapsed under its own weight. The loss was enormous, both financially and in terms of Makarov's credibility. Despite Petrov's best efforts to avoid direct conflict, Makarov's attacks grew more brazen. He began using more overt methods, such as threatening Petrov's allies and trying to stir up dissent within Petrov's organization. But Petrov had already anticipated this shift. He knew that Makarov would eventually resort to violence, and he had taken steps to ensure that his people would be ready. Petrov's loyalists were prepared for anything, armed, trained, and willing to defend their leader at all costs. In 1998, the situation came to a head. Makarov, frustrated by his inability to gain ground against Petrov's operations, decided to launch a direct assault. His men raided one of Petrov's construction sites, aiming to send a clear message. They set fire to the building, hoping to destroy not only Petrov's financial interests but also his reputation as a feared and untouchable figure in the criminal world. What Makarov didn't realize was that Petrov had already anticipated this move. A few hours before the raid, one of Petrov's moles within Makarov's organization had tipped him off about the planned attack. Petrov's enforcers were already waiting, hidden in the shadows. When Makarov's men arrived, they were met with resistance. The attack quickly turned into a firefight, with casualties on both sides. Makarov's men were forced to retreat, and the construction site, though damaged, was saved. The failure of the raid sent a clear message to Makarov: Petrov was not a man to be underestimated. Petrov's calculated moves, combined with his loyal and well-prepared enforcers, had foiled Makarov's direct attempt at retaliation. From that point on, Makarov knew that Petrov was not just a rival, he was a force to be reckoned with. In the aftermath of the failed raid, Petrov's reputation soared. His ability to avoid direct confrontation, while still securing his interests, became legendary. Even Makarov, though humiliated by his failure, couldn't help but acknowledge Petrov's brilliance. But the conflict between the two men was far from over. For Makarov, the fight had become personal, and he knew that as long as Petrov was in control, he would never be able to take the reins of Ukraine's criminal and business empires. But Petrov had already shown that he was not easily defeated. He had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. By the end of the 1990s, Viktor Petrov's empire had become something of an enigma. While much of the Ukrainian underworld was dominated by overt displays of power, violence, and brutality, Petrov's approach was fundamentally different. He was, by all accounts, a shadowy figure, a man whose influence stretched far and wide, yet whose presence was barely noticeable to the public eye. His empire, though vast, was built on layers of secrecy and subtlety, with much of it hidden behind the facades of legitimate businesses. As the new millennium dawned, Petrov's position in the Ukrainian criminal world was secure, but his quiet reign was about to be tested in ways that would change the course of his life forever. In 2000, Petrov faced one of his most significant challenges yet. A powerful group of businessmen, many of whom were former Soviet elites, had begun to challenge his control over Ukraine's economic resources. This group, known as the New Oligarchs, was composed of individuals who had thrived in the chaos following the Soviet collapse. They were ruthless and had no qualms about using violence to get what they wanted. But what set them apart from the others was their ability to play the political game. They understood the importance of establishing connections with high-ranking government officials, both in Ukraine and abroad. Unlike Makarov, who had been largely focused on taking over Petrov's operations through direct confrontation, the new oligarchs were far more subtle. They knew that controlling Petrov's empire required more than just physical dominance. They needed access to the political machinery that could protect their interests and, at the same time, weaken Petrov's hold on the country's industries. The oligarchs, unlike many of Petrov's past rivals, were not just criminals, they were also businessmen, skilled negotiators, and manipulators of the political system. Petrov, ever the strategist, knew that he couldn't afford to let these men get too comfortable. He had already seen the way they had infiltrated various sectors of the Ukrainian economy. The new oligarchs were gaining power, and their reach was extending into every corner of the country's business landscape. This was no longer just about protecting his turf, it was about maintaining his dominance over an entire nation's resources. But Petrov was not a man to panic. Instead, he began to methodically assess his position and his options. The first step Petrov took in countering the new oligarchs was to strengthen his ties with the government. While many of the oligarchs had successfully ingrained themselves into the political elite, Petrov understood that true power came from controlling both sides of the equation, the criminal world and the political apparatus. Over the years, Petrov had cultivated a network of loyalists within key government ministries, law enforcement, and the military. These men, who owed their success to Petrov's influence, were ready to do whatever it took to keep him at the top. Petrov's second step was to expand his influence beyond Ukraine. With the rise of the new oligarchs, Petrov knew that he couldn't afford to operate within the confines of one country. He needed to position himself as an international player, someone whose reach extended far beyond the borders of Ukraine. To do this, Petrov leveraged his existing contacts in Russia and Eastern Europe, forming alliances with powerful figures in the criminal world who could help him protect his interests abroad. These alliances allowed him to extend his influence over the emerging markets in Eastern Europe, which had begun to attract significant foreign investment in the early 2000s. One of Petrov's closest allies during this time was Ivan Karpov, a Russian oligarch who controlled a significant portion of the country's oil exports. Karpov, though a rival to many of the other Ukrainian oligarchs, had always respected Petrov's business acumen. The two men had an unspoken understanding, both knew the importance of maintaining the delicate balance of power. Karpov's involvement in the oil trade allowed Petrov to expand his influence in the energy sector, giving him a vital foothold in the Russian market. Together, they controlled vast amounts of energy resources, making them a formidable pair in both the criminal and business worlds. Despite the strength of his alliances, Petrov's position was not without its challenges. As the years went on, the political landscape in Ukraine became increasingly unstable. The new oligarchs, with their connections to high-ranking government officials, were beginning to exert more control over the country's economy. The threat to Petrov's empire was no longer a distant possibility, it was becoming a reality. Petrov knew that in order to stay ahead, he would need to employ even more cunning and strategy. In the early 2000s, a series of political upheavals began to shake Ukraine to its core. The government, long dominated by a mix of old Soviet-era leaders and new, powerful businessmen, was starting to crack under the weight of corruption, inefficiency, and increasing public discontent. Petrov, ever the opportunist, saw this as his chance to assert his influence in a more direct way. He began to use his extensive network to support certain politicians who he believed could help him maintain control. At the same time, he quietly worked to undermine those who were loyal to his rivals in the new oligarchs. One of the most significant moves Petrov made during this period was his quiet support of the opposition leader, Viktor Yushchenko. Yushchenko, a reformist candidate, had begun to gain momentum in his bid for the presidency. Petrov, understanding the importance of having an ally in the highest office in the land, subtly threw his weight behind Yushchenko's campaign. While he never publicly endorsed the candidate, Petrov made sure that key figures within his network were working behind the scenes to sway public opinion in favor of Yushchenko. But Petrov's influence was not unlimited. The new oligarchs had their own plans, and they weren't about to let Petrov dictate the course of Ukraine's future. By 2004, the political climate in Ukraine had reached a boiling point. Yushchenko's bid for the presidency culminated in the Orange Revolution, a series of protests and political upheavals that ultimately resulted in the election of Yushchenko. For Petrov, the outcome was bittersweet. Though his support had helped to tip the scales in favor of the opposition, he knew that Yushchenko's presidency would not guarantee his continued dominance. In the end, Petrov's success during this time was a testament to his remarkable ability to adapt. As the political and business landscape of Ukraine changed, so too did Petrov. He shifted his alliances, expanded his influence internationally, and learned to play the game at the highest level. But even as he adapted to new challenges, one thing remained constant: his ability to stay one step ahead of those who sought to unseat him. The world around him might have been changing, but Petrov's control over his empire remained unshaken. The year 2005 marked a turning point for Viktor Petrov, as the tides of change surged ever closer to his doorstep. The Orange Revolution, while providing Ukraine with new hope and a shift in political dynamics, also posed a threat to Petrov's carefully built empire. With the rise of Viktor Yushchenko, a reformist candidate who had strong Western ties, came the possibility of major political and economic reforms. For someone like Petrov, who had thrived in the chaos of post-Soviet Ukraine, this was a critical juncture. He had spent years cultivating his influence in the murky waters of corruption, but now, those same waters were beginning to dry up as the winds of reform blew through the country. Petrov was never a man to sit idle. As Ukraine's political landscape became more polarized, his first instinct was to assess the potential dangers and weigh his options. The early days of Yushchenko's presidency were filled with optimism for change, yet Petrov understood that reform was not always a one-way street. While Yushchenko's government sought to root out corruption, Petrov knew from experience that such efforts often led to chaos, instability, and, eventually, new opportunities for those who were savvy enough to take advantage of them. He could not afford to be swept away by the tide of reform, and so, as always, he began to recalibrate his operations, ensuring that his empire would continue to thrive even as the political winds shifted around him. In the early months of Yushchenko's presidency, Petrov's greatest asset was his ability to remain inconspicuous. He was, as always, the shadow in the background, the man whose name was rarely spoken in public yet whose influence extended deep into the heart of Ukrainian politics, business, and criminal enterprises. Yushchenko's administration, though committed to reform, was still filled with individuals who had ties to the old regime. Petrov, recognizing this, began to quietly foster relationships with key figures within the government, men who were caught between the demands of the new leadership and the entrenched power structures of the past. These figures, often overlooked by those focused on the more public aspects of politics, would become invaluable allies for Petrov as the years went on. Petrov's ability to forge these hidden alliances was key to his survival in a political climate that seemed to be growing more hostile by the day. But while Petrov was securing his position in the corridors of power, he was also paying close attention to the movements of his rivals. The new oligarchs, though weakened by the turbulence of the Orange Revolution, were still a formidable force. Their access to resources, their connections to Russia, and their ability to influence government policy made them a constant threat. For Petrov, however, they were just another challenge to navigate. One of the most significant events during this period was the growing tension between Ukraine and Russia. As the country began to embrace closer ties with the West, particularly with the European Union and NATO, Russia, under President Vladimir Putin, began to assert its dominance over its former satellite states. Petrov, ever the pragmatist, knew that this geopolitical shift would have significant implications for his operations. He had long maintained close ties with Russian business and political elites, and the possibility of a closer Ukraine-West relationship threatened to undermine the power dynamics in which he had thrived. Petrov understood that, for all the talk of Ukraine's pro-Western aspirations, the country's true economic survival lay in its relationship with Russia. Russia was not only a key supplier of natural gas to Ukraine, but it was also a vital partner for many of Petrov's business ventures. With tensions rising between the two nations, Petrov found himself at a crossroads. He could continue to deepen his connections with Russian power brokers, but that would place him at odds with Yushchenko's reformist agenda. Alternatively, he could embrace the West, aligning himself with Ukraine's new direction, but that would risk alienating some of his most powerful allies. It was at this critical juncture that Petrov made a decision that would define his survival in the years to come: he would play both sides. As always, Petrov was a master of balancing competing interests, and he understood that in order to maintain his empire, he needed to navigate the increasingly complex international landscape with caution and precision. To achieve this, Petrov began to quietly reach out to Western diplomats, business leaders, and investors, offering his services as a guide to the political and business realities of Ukraine. At the same time, he continued to maintain strong ties with Russian oligarchs and politicians, ensuring that his operations would not be disrupted by any sudden shifts in foreign policy. Petrov's dual approach allowed him to play both sides against each other, ensuring that, no matter the direction the winds of political change blew, his empire would remain untouchable. By 2006, Petrov had successfully navigated the shifting sands of Ukraine's political environment. Though he had faced numerous challenges, political upheaval, economic instability, and the looming threat of reform, he had managed to secure his position as one of the most powerful men in the country. But Petrov knew that survival in the criminal underworld, particularly in a world that was becoming more transparent and interconnected, required constant adaptation. His ability to read the political landscape, build strategic alliances, and remain in the shadows had allowed him to maintain his grip on power. However, as the years went on, Petrov's empire would come to face even greater challenges that would test his skill as a strategist and his ability to stay ahead of his enemies. In 2007, the political climate in Ukraine became even more volatile, with factionalism and corruption continuing to plague the government. Petrov, ever the tactician, saw this as an opportunity to expand his influence. As the government struggled to maintain control, Petrov began to quietly support various political factions, ensuring that his interests would be protected no matter which group ultimately emerged victorious. But Petrov's operations were not without their risks. He knew that the more involved he became in Ukraine's political turmoil, the greater the chance of exposure. He had to remain vigilant, calculating, and always one step ahead of those who sought to take him down. It was during these years, as Petrov continued to cement his position at the top of Ukraine's underworld, that he began to realize the true nature of his power. No longer was he merely a criminal mastermind, he had become a kingmaker, a shadow ruler whose influence stretched far beyond the boundaries of the criminal world. His ability to manipulate the levers of power, both legal and illegal, had made him a figure to be reckoned with. But in the world Petrov inhabited, power was always fleeting. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and everything he had built could come crashing down. And so, as he had done countless times before, Petrov continued to adapt, to play the long game, and to survive against all odds. As Ukraine's political scene continued to evolve through the late 2000s, Viktor Petrov found himself facing new and more pressing challenges. While his criminal empire remained formidable, the landscape in which he operated was growing more complex by the day. Petrov, who had always been a step ahead of his competitors, had to adapt yet again as the balance of power began to shift in unexpected ways. The old days of open brutality and raw force were slowly being replaced by a more subtle, more insidious form of influence, one that was rooted in political manipulation, international alliances, and economic control. For Petrov, this meant one thing: he had to evolve or risk being consumed by the very system he had helped build. The early 2010s marked the beginning of a new era for Petrov. The rise of the internet, social media, and global connectivity brought a wave of change to the world's political and economic systems. No longer could men like Petrov operate entirely in the shadows. The world was becoming more transparent, more interconnected, and this posed a significant threat to someone whose power was rooted in secrecy. However, as always, Petrov was not one to shy away from challenges. He saw opportunity in every crisis, and he quickly set to work rebranding his empire for the digital age. One of Petrov's most significant moves during this period was his decision to expand his criminal enterprises into the burgeoning world of cybercrime. With the rise of the internet came new avenues for money laundering, fraud, and extortion, all of which fit perfectly into Petrov's long-standing modus operandi. He had always been adept at exploiting loopholes, and now, with the digital world opening up new opportunities for criminal activity, Petrov began to build a vast network of hackers, digital con artists, and cyber mercenaries. These individuals, many of whom were drawn to the high stakes of the emerging online black market, provided Petrov with the tools to maintain his grip on power. What made Petrov's foray into cybercrime so successful was his ability to operate quietly behind the scenes. While others in the underworld might have been drawn to the flashy world of online scams and hacking for the fame and fortune, Petrov remained focused on the long-term gains. He used the new technology to create hidden channels for moving money, laundering profits, and controlling digital assets. His influence in the world of online crime allowed him to tap into international markets, laundering money through cryptocurrency exchanges, and creating elaborate shell companies that spanned across multiple continents. Yet, despite his success in the digital realm, Petrov knew that he could never entirely abandon his traditional methods. The old ways of violence, intimidation, and force were still essential tools in maintaining control, especially in a world where the line between the criminal and the political was becoming increasingly blurred. By this time, Petrov had already amassed a vast network of politicians, law enforcement officials, and military personnel who owed their positions to his influence. His network was vast, and his reach was long. This gave him the ability to manipulate events from behind the scenes, quietly eliminating threats before they could take root. During this period, Petrov's empire began to face new challenges from rival factions that were growing in strength. While he had once been the undisputed king of Ukraine's underworld, new players were beginning to rise up, some with their own international connections, others with a boldness that Petrov had not seen before. These new figures were not content with simply working within Petrov's framework, they wanted to expand, to carve out their own territories, and to challenge Petrov's dominance. They were emboldened by the growing sense of lawlessness in Ukraine and by the growing instability of the country's political system. One of the most prominent of these new rivals was a former KGB officer named Mikhail Dravorsky. Dravorsky, who had been involved in Russia's intelligence services for years, had built his own criminal empire with the help of former Soviet loyalists. He was ruthless, calculating, and, perhaps most importantly, he had the backing of powerful figures within Russia's government. While Petrov had always been able to rely on his network of loyalists and allies, Dravorsky's connection to the Russian state presented a serious threat. At first, Petrov dismissed Dravorsky as a minor nuisance, another ambitious criminal who would quickly burn out. But as Dravorsky's influence began to grow, Petrov realized that he could not afford to ignore the man. Dravorsky had begun to extend his reach into Ukraine, slowly building alliances with local politicians and businessmen who were eager for the stability and protection he offered. Petrov knew that the KGB officer's rise in power could have serious consequences for his own empire, and so he began to take steps to eliminate the threat. Petrov's first move was to use his influence within Ukraine's security services to launch a covert investigation into Dravorsky's operations. Petrov knew that in the murky world of espionage and intelligence, information was power. By feeding information to the right people, he was able to create an air of suspicion around Dravorsky's activities. At the same time, he reached out to some of his old allies in the Russian government, subtly implying that Dravorsky's growing influence could disrupt the delicate balance of power between Ukraine and Russia. But Dravorsky was no fool. He quickly caught wind of Petrov's machinations and, in turn, began to maneuver in ways that forced Petrov onto the defensive. He knew that Petrov's greatest strength, his ability to operate in the shadows, was also his greatest weakness. Dravorsky, by contrast, was a master at controlling the narrative. He had the ability to make his presence known, to dominate the political stage, and to turn public opinion in his favor. The growing tension between the two men came to a head in 2010, when Dravorsky orchestrated a daring public move. He managed to orchestrate a series of high-profile assassinations that sent shockwaves through Ukraine's political elite. The killings, though expertly executed, were seen as a direct challenge to Petrov's dominance in the region. For the first time in years, Petrov's empire was visibly under attack. This assassination campaign was a bold and direct message, not just to Petrov, but to the entire criminal world. It was an attempt to unseat the old guard and claim the mantle of power for himself. Dravorsky's actions forced Petrov to reconsider his approach. The old ways of subtlety and secrecy were no longer enough. He had to make a statement, to remind the world of his power. But even as Petrov began to plot his next move, one question lingered in the back of his mind: was he still the shadow master he had once been, or had the world around him changed beyond recognition? By 2011, Viktor Petrov was facing a critical juncture in both his criminal empire and his life. The balance of power within Ukraine had become more fragile, and with it, his carefully constructed world of influence seemed to be slipping through his fingers. While the rise of Mikhail Dravorsky had shaken Petrov's foundations, it wasn't the only threat to his power. The geopolitical situation was changing in unpredictable ways. Ukraine's ongoing struggle between East and West was beginning to fracture the political landscape further, and this division was something Petrov had been able to exploit for years. Now, however, the divisions were growing sharper, and Petrov's ability to manipulate them was starting to wane. Petrov's empire had always relied on a delicate balance of cooperation between business, politics, and crime. He knew how to make deals with oligarchs and politicians, how to shield himself from law enforcement, and how to operate in the shadows. But now, the world he had known for so long was becoming more visible and harder to control. The internet had brought a new level of transparency, and Western governments were growing more involved in Ukraine's political affairs. The West, particularly the European Union and the United States, were watching Ukraine closely, pushing for reforms and stronger anti-corruption measures. The question on everyone's mind was whether Ukraine would align more with the West or continue its historical ties with Russia. And, as always, Petrov stood at the intersection of these competing forces, trying to navigate through a minefield of shifting alliances. Petrov, ever the opportunist, knew he had to move swiftly. He had already seen how the Ukrainian government had struggled to deal with the growing influence of Russia and the rise of pro-Western factions. But he also knew that any drastic shift in Ukraine's international alliances could upset the delicate balance that had allowed him to prosper. He had ties to both sides, the Russian oligarchs who had long been his business partners and the Ukrainian politicians who owed him favors. It was a balancing act, one that required both subtlety and foresight. However, as the pressure mounted, Petrov began to see that the time for subtlety was coming to an end. A more direct approach would be necessary to survive in this rapidly changing environment. One of the most significant moves Petrov made in the early 2010s was his involvement in the controversial 2012 parliamentary elections. While he had always been careful to stay out of the public eye, Petrov recognized that the elections were an opportunity to cement his influence within Ukraine's political elite. The elections were marred by allegations of corruption, voter fraud, and the manipulation of public opinion. Petrov, ever the strategist, saw this as an opening to increase his control over Ukraine's political infrastructure. He knew that by backing the right candidates, he could ensure that his interests were protected, if not in the public eye, then certainly behind the scenes. In the lead-up to the 2012 elections, Petrov forged alliances with key members of the ruling Party of Regions, a political faction that was aligned with the pro-Russian government of President Viktor Yanukovych. The Party of Regions was dominated by businessmen, many of whom had close ties to organized crime. It was a network that Petrov was all too familiar with. By backing these politicians, he ensured that his businesses could continue to operate unhindered, while simultaneously gaining new leverage over the country's political decision-making process. He also used his influence to prevent his rivals from gaining a foothold in the election. His efforts were successful. His allies won key seats, ensuring that his position was solidified within Ukraine's power structure. But Petrov's maneuvering wasn't limited to the political realm. He continued to use his criminal networks to expand his influence over Ukraine's economy. As the country's political situation became more unstable, businesses and investors grew wary of the uncertainty surrounding the future. Petrov, always calculating, knew that such instability created new opportunities for those who were willing to take risks. He invested heavily in Ukraine's natural resources sector, particularly in coal and steel, two industries that had long been dominated by a small group of oligarchs. Petrov's strategy was simple: he would buy up key assets, make strategic alliances, and control the flow of goods and services. His empire grew, extending its reach further into the fabric of Ukraine's economy. However, Petrov's political maneuvering and economic expansion didn't go unnoticed. His growing influence within the government and economy brought him into direct conflict with other powerful figures, particularly in the business world. One of his most notable rivals during this period was Dmitry Frolov, a wealthy and ambitious businessman with close ties to both the Russian government and Ukraine's own political elite. Frolov, who had long coveted the same resources Petrov was now controlling, began to challenge Petrov's authority in increasingly brazen ways. The two men, who had once shared a mutual respect, found themselves locked in a high-stakes game of power and influence. Frolov's rise was particularly threatening to Petrov, as he had the backing of key figures within the Ukrainian government, including members of the powerful Ministry of Internal Affairs. Frolov was also able to draw on his connections to Russian businessmen, giving him a unique advantage over Petrov. He was no longer just a rival, he had become a formidable adversary. The tension between Petrov and Frolov came to a head in 2013, when Frolov attempted to seize control of one of Petrov's most lucrative coal mines. This move was a direct challenge to Petrov's business empire and represented a clear attempt to undermine his position in Ukraine's economic hierarchy. Petrov, never one to back down from a challenge, responded swiftly. He used his influence within Ukraine's security services to launch a covert campaign against Frolov's business interests. Petrov's network of loyalists began to sabotage Frolov's operations, ensuring that his rival's rise was halted before it could gain real momentum. The battle between the two men became a vicious cycle of attacks, counterattacks, and escalating tensions. At the same time, Petrov had to contend with the growing unrest in Ukraine's political climate. In 2013, widespread protests began to erupt across the country, fueled by dissatisfaction with the government's handling of the economy and its failure to enact meaningful reforms. These protests, which culminated in the Euromaidan movement, posed a significant threat to the stability of Ukraine's government and to Petrov's own operations. While many of the protesters were calling for closer ties with the European Union, Petrov knew that the instability created by the protests could present both a threat and an opportunity. As Ukraine's political future hung in the balance, Petrov prepared for what was to come next, fully aware that the game was changing once again. In the midst of these political and business upheavals, Petrov's focus remained singular: survival. His ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to read the political and economic climate, and to maintain control over his criminal operations was what had kept him at the top for so long. But now, with new rivals emerging and the geopolitical stakes higher than ever, Petrov knew that his empire could no longer be run in the same way. The rules had changed, and Petrov would need to change with them if he was to remain the shadow master of Ukraine. As 2014 dawned, Viktor Petrov's world had already begun to shift dramatically. The geopolitical landscape of Ukraine had reached a breaking point, and the violent conflict that would soon engulf the country was already simmering beneath the surface. The Euromaidan protests, which had initially been a cry for reform and a pivot toward Europe, had escalated into full-scale political unrest. The streets of Kiev were filled with protesters, demanding the resignation of President Viktor Yanukovych, whose pro-Russian stance had alienated many Ukrainians. As the violence increased, so too did the uncertainty surrounding Petrov's empire. His power was no longer just a matter of controlling crime and political influence within Ukraine, it was now about survival in an environment that was becoming more hostile by the day. For Petrov, the onset of the Ukrainian Revolution was both an opportunity and a threat. The political vacuum that was forming offered a unique chance to expand his influence, but it also left him vulnerable to those who might seek to displace him from the shadows. Petrov's criminal empire had been built on an intricate web of relationships with Ukraine's political elite, many of whom were now caught in the storm of revolution. Petrov knew that those who had once been his allies, men he had controlled with bribes, threats, and favors, were now looking for ways to survive the growing chaos. Some were scrambling to maintain their power, while others were opportunistically turning against him. In the first months of 2014, Petrov maintained a relatively low profile, watching carefully from the sidelines as the political crisis unfolded. The government had cracked down hard on the protesters, resulting in the deaths of dozens of civilians in the streets of Kiev. Despite the bloodshed, the protests did not abate, and they only gained more traction. The call for Yanukovych's ousting grew louder, and Petrov knew that, if the president fell, the balance of power in Ukraine would be irrevocably altered. He also recognized the looming danger posed by the rise of nationalist factions, who were eager to push for a more democratic and Western-aligned Ukraine, one that would reject figures like Petrov and his criminal networks. When Yanukovych was ultimately ousted in February 2014, Petrov found himself at a crossroads. The new government, now led by the interim president Alexander Turchinov, was openly pro-Western, and the prospect of stronger ties with the European Union raised alarms within the Kremlin. Petrov, who had long enjoyed the protection of Russian-backed political elites, understood that this was a dangerous moment for him and his network. The government's crackdown on oligarchs and corrupt figures was gaining momentum, and Petrov's criminal enterprises could no longer operate with the same level of impunity they once had. The rise of nationalist sentiment in Ukraine also meant that his ties to Russia would no longer be viewed with indifference. His empire, which had thrived in the shadows of Ukraine's pro-Russian government, was now exposed to new and dangerous scrutiny. In this moment of uncertainty, Petrov did what he had always done best: he adapted. If Ukraine was slipping further away from Russia's sphere of influence, Petrov knew he had to reposition himself to survive. The first step was consolidating his power in the regions where his criminal networks were most entrenched. He tightened his grip on Ukraine's industrial heartland, where he controlled lucrative sectors like coal, steel, and manufacturing. These were the lifeblood of Ukraine's economy, and Petrov had long understood the importance of controlling them. The newly formed interim government may have been struggling to regain control of the country, but Petrov knew the value of economic power in a time of political upheaval. At the same time, Petrov's loyalty to the Russian Federation remained unshaken. With Ukraine's political trajectory now shifting westward, Petrov's ties to the Kremlin became even more critical. He quietly reached out to his contacts in Russia, letting them know that, despite the political shift in Ukraine, he was still a reliable ally. He used his connections in the Russian government and business circles to secure backing for his criminal operations, ensuring that the Moscow elite understood the value of maintaining a strategic relationship with him. Petrov, ever the pragmatist, recognized that he had to tread carefully. While he continued to work behind the scenes to maintain his power in Ukraine, he also began to cultivate new relationships in the West, particularly in Europe. Petrov's networks were wide-ranging, and he was no stranger to navigating the corridors of power in both Eastern and Western capitals. He began to quietly diversify his investments, taking steps to ensure that his empire could weather the storm, regardless of which direction the political winds blew. Despite his careful positioning, Petrov found himself caught in the middle of an escalating conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The annexation of Crimea by Russia in March 2014 was a critical turning point. The crisis in Crimea would ultimately lead to the outbreak of armed conflict in eastern Ukraine, as pro-Russian separatists seized control of key regions like Donetsk and Luhansk. Petrov, like many of his fellow oligarchs, found himself forced to make a decision: align himself fully with Russia or risk being swept away by the tide of nationalism that was rising in Ukraine. For Petrov, the choice was clear. His ties to Russia had been the cornerstone of his rise to power, and he could not afford to lose that alliance. While the Ukrainian government cracked down on pro-Russian separatists in the east, Petrov sought ways to profit from the growing instability. He used his connections to facilitate the movement of arms, supplies, and cash across the border, ensuring that his criminal enterprises could continue to thrive in the midst of the chaos. Petrov's ability to operate in the shadows, using his vast network of loyalists and allies, allowed him to maintain his control over key sectors of the economy, even as the country teetered on the edge of civil war. Petrov also recognized the shifting allegiances within Ukraine's political elite. The old order, based on corruption and strongman tactics, was quickly giving way to a new set of leaders who were eager to align themselves with the West. Petrov saw the rise of these figures as a direct threat to his empire. Nationalist factions and pro-European politicians were pushing for reform, and Petrov's once untouchable position was now under threat. However, Petrov was no ordinary oligarch. He had survived countless political shifts before, and he knew how to play the game. He quietly worked behind the scenes to create new alliances, ensuring that his interests were protected, even as the country descended into chaos. By the middle of 2014, Petrov had come to the painful realization that the world he had built in Ukraine was rapidly disintegrating. The revolution, the annexation of Crimea, and the war in the east had fundamentally altered the balance of power. Petrov's grip on his criminal empire was loosening, but he wasn't ready to let go. He had always been a survivor, and in this moment of crisis, he was determined to adapt once again, to secure his future, and to maintain his influence in a world that was changing faster than he could keep up. As the conflict in eastern Ukraine deepened, Viktor Petrov found himself in a precarious position. The war in Donbass, which had erupted in 2014, was a direct challenge to everything Petrov had worked for. The Ukrainian government was locked in a brutal struggle with pro-Russian separatists, and the chaos in the region created new opportunities but also severe risks. For someone like Petrov, whose power had always been rooted in the shadows, the growing instability could either be an avenue for further expansion or a threat to his very survival. By the summer of 2014, Petrov had been quietly repositioning his assets in anticipation of the war's long-term effects. He was aware that Ukraine's fractured political landscape, combined with the economic sanctions imposed by the West on Russia, would create massive upheaval in the country. Petrov was no stranger to economic crisis. He had weathered financial storms in the past, but this was different. The stakes were higher. The future of his empire, which spanned key industries and political networks, depended on how he adapted to the rapidly changing situation. Petrov's initial response to the conflict was measured. He avoided direct involvement, taking care not to draw attention to himself in the early stages of the war. Instead, he maintained his business interests in the industrial sectors that were still functioning in the parts of Ukraine unaffected by the fighting. Petrov's ties to the Ukrainian steel and coal industries, in particular, provided him with leverage. These industries were essential to the war effort, and whoever controlled them would hold immense power. As such, Petrov's operations continued as usual, though he took extra precautions to keep his involvement behind the scenes. The situation in Donbass, however, was rapidly evolving. Pro-Russian forces were making significant gains, and the Ukrainian government was struggling to maintain control over its eastern territories. This conflict, far from a regional skirmish, had become an international flashpoint, drawing in the attention of the West and Russia. Petrov, ever the pragmatist, saw an opportunity. The instability created by the war would force the Ukrainian government to seek external support, and Petrov knew that this support would come with strings attached. Western influence in Ukraine was growing, and the presence of NATO advisors and Western-backed NGOs was increasingly visible. For Petrov, this shifting balance of power presented an intriguing opportunity. He could use his connections in both Ukraine and Russia to position himself as a vital intermediary, bridging the gap between the West and the pro-Russian factions. But this strategy carried significant risk. In a fractured political environment, trust was scarce, and alliances were fickle. Petrov was a man who had thrived in the shadows, but the world was changing, and the shadows were getting smaller. In the midst of this turmoil, Petrov found himself entangled in a struggle for control of key assets in the eastern regions of Ukraine. One of his primary competitors was Dmitry Frolov, his rival from the earlier years, who had managed to position himself as one of the most influential figures in Donbass. Frolov, whose ties to the Russian government were deepening by the day, was gaining support from the pro-Russian separatists, who were now fighting alongside Russian forces. As the battle for control of the region intensified, Frolov and Petrov found themselves on a collision course. The rivalry between Petrov and Frolov had always been a battle of egos, but now it was a war for survival. Frolov, with his growing support among the separatists, was able to secure critical infrastructure, including coal mines and steel plants, in Donbass. For Petrov, these were valuable assets. His ability to control the flow of coal and steel had always been a cornerstone of his empire, and losing access to these resources would be catastrophic. Petrov, however, was no stranger to conflict. He knew how to navigate through such turbulent times. In response to Frolov's growing influence, Petrov began to use his extensive network of loyalists in Kiev and beyond to push back. He leveraged his relationships with key politicians and law enforcement officials, making subtle but powerful moves to disrupt Frolov's operations. Petrov's strategy was to weaken Frolov's base of support, sowing distrust among his allies and making it clear that Petrov was the true power broker in Ukraine. Petrov understood that the war in Donbass wasn't just about military victory, it was about control of resources, and he was determined not to let Frolov claim the spoils. By the fall of 2014, the war in the East was taking its toll. The economy was spiraling downward, and Ukraine was struggling to keep its head above water. The country was now caught between the competing forces of Western-backed reformers and pro-Russian separatists. The longer the conflict raged, the more Petrov realized that he had to act decisively. He could no longer remain on the sidelines, waiting for opportunities to present themselves. Petrov needed to make a bold move to reassert his dominance. In November of 2014, Petrov made his move. He orchestrated a series of clandestine meetings with influential figures in both the Ukrainian government and the separatist factions. His goal was to broker a deal that would allow him to expand his control over the resources in Donbass without directly taking sides in the conflict. Petrov's connections to the political elite in Kiev remained strong, and he used this to his advantage, offering financial incentives and promises of future political support. To the separatists, he offered a guarantee of access to crucial resources, ensuring that they would benefit from his business interests while continuing their struggle against the Ukrainian government. In exchange, Petrov secured control over several key coal mines and steel factories in Donbass. The negotiations were difficult and fraught with danger. Trust was in short supply, and betrayal lurked at every corner. But Petrov's ability to negotiate in the shadows, his experience in navigating complex relationships, and his ruthless determination paid off. By the end of 2014, Petrov had successfully expanded his reach into the heart of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. His business empire, though battered by the war, was stronger than ever. However, Petrov's success came at a cost. His ties to both Russia and Ukraine were becoming increasingly apparent, and as the war in Donbass continued, the pressure on him grew. The West, which had once viewed Petrov as a shadowy figure to be tolerated, now began to see him as a threat. His role in the ongoing conflict and his support for pro-Russian factions made him a target for international sanctions. The delicate balance Petrov had maintained for so long was beginning to unravel, and his survival would depend on his ability to navigate these new challenges. As the conflict dragged on into 2015, Petrov found himself facing an ever-tightening web of international pressure, political instability, and personal rivalries. Yet, through it all, he remained one step ahead, always looking for the next opportunity, always calculating his next move. The war had changed the landscape of Ukraine, but Petrov had always been a master of adaptation, and in the chaos, he saw not just threats, but opportunities. As 2015 began, Viktor Petrov's empire was far from secure. Despite his growing influence in the chaos of eastern Ukraine, the risks surrounding him were mounting. The conflict in Donbass showed no signs of ending, and the international community's pressure on Ukraine to reform was intensifying. While Petrov had managed to maintain his hold over crucial industries, the political landscape was shifting under his feet. Western sanctions, aimed at Russia and its allies, had begun to take a toll on his business operations. Petrov had long been adept at navigating these kinds of challenges, but the stakes had never been higher. In the eyes of the Ukrainian government, Petrov was a figurehead of the old corrupt regime, a relic of the past who stood in direct opposition to the country's aspirations for a more democratic and transparent future. As the pro-Western government in Kiev tightened its grip on power, Petrov's relationship with Russian officials grew more complicated. While his connections in Moscow remained strong, the Kremlin's approach to Ukraine was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Vladimir Putin's desire to control the region, paired with growing isolation from the West, made Petrov's position more precarious. Petrov understood better than most that his survival hinged not just on his ability to control key industries and political relationships, but on his capacity to adapt to a world in which his familiar methods of power were under constant scrutiny. He had built his empire on a foundation of secrecy and manipulation, thriving in a world of whispers and shadows. But as the international spotlight turned to Ukraine, Petrov was no longer able to operate with the same level of discretion. The very elements that had allowed him to rise to power were now becoming liabilities. One of the more immediate threats to Petrov's empire came from the Ukrainian military's ongoing attempts to regain control over separatist-held territories in Donbass. As Kiev's forces advanced, the potential for the Ukrainian government to regain control of the key industrial areas Petrov controlled was growing. These areas, rich in coal and steel resources, were vital not just to Ukraine's economy, but to Petrov's continued dominance. To lose them would be catastrophic for his empire. To counter this, Petrov took a more aggressive stance in his dealings with both the Ukrainian government and the separatist factions. He began funding paramilitary groups in Donbass, ensuring that they were well-equipped and well-funded, and he used his vast network of corrupt officials to undermine the Ukrainian army's efforts. In doing so, Petrov positioned himself as an indispensable figure in the war's logistics and financing. He became an intermediary, brokering deals between separatist forces, Russian-backed operatives, and those in Kiev who were willing to turn a blind eye to his dealings. Yet, despite his ability to control the flow of resources, Petrov was beginning to feel the pressure of the world beyond Ukraine's borders. The West was increasingly vocal about his role in the conflict. As European governments and the United States ramped up their sanctions against Russian interests, Petrov found it harder to move money, launder proceeds, and maintain his connections in international business. His empire, built on secrecy and shadowy dealings, was now vulnerable to outside interference. Even his most trusted allies in the West were growing reluctant to do business with him, knowing that any association with Petrov would bring unwanted scrutiny. In this period of growing external pressure, Petrov had no choice but to strengthen his ties to those who could offer him protection. In late 2015, he began to deepen his relationship with Russia's intelligence services, particularly the FSB, Federal Security Service. He understood that the Kremlin's strategic interests in Ukraine would not wane, and as the conflict in Donbass persisted, Petrov knew he needed to secure his position with those who had the real power. The FSB, with its vast network of operatives and influence over Russian military operations, was a valuable ally. Petrov offered them access to his resources, using his control of industrial infrastructure to provide military-grade supplies and financing for the Russian-backed separatists. In exchange, the FSB offered Petrov protection from international sanctions and ensured that his criminal enterprises remained undisturbed by foreign authorities. Yet, even with the support of the FSB, Petrov was not immune to the changing tides. The political environment within Russia itself was beginning to shift. The growing pressure from the West, combined with Russia's increasing isolation, was having an effect on the internal dynamics of the Russian elite. Petrov, who had long relied on the favor of Moscow's oligarchs, was beginning to feel the strain of a tightening political climate. The Kremlin's leadership, including Putin's closest allies, had their own agendas, and Petrov's position as an independent power broker was becoming less secure. Petrov began to realize that the influence he had so carefully cultivated over the years was no longer enough. He could no longer rely solely on his business operations or his ties to corrupt officials. The landscape was evolving too quickly, and Petrov needed to secure new alliances if he hoped to remain relevant. This realization forced him to turn his attention to the broader picture, how the changing political and economic dynamics in Russia, Ukraine, and the West were affecting his business interests and his long-term survival. While he had always been known for his ability to adapt, Petrov knew this time would require more than just maneuvering within the criminal underworld. He would need to make decisions that would position him not just as a figurehead in Ukraine's war, but as an integral part of a larger geopolitical strategy. He began to look beyond the immediate chaos of Donbass and consider the future of his empire. The war in Ukraine, as tragic as it was, had opened doors for new alliances and new opportunities. Petrov's long-term strategy involved positioning himself as a central figure in the ongoing conflict, capable of brokering deals between Russia, Ukraine, and the West. In the face of all this uncertainty, Petrov was forced to confront the reality that his future was increasingly uncertain. The risks were greater than ever, but so were the rewards. Petrov had lived through many turbulent moments, and as 2016 loomed, he was ready to once again test the limits of his power. His empire may have been under siege, but Viktor Petrov had always thrived in the shadows, and in those shadows, he could see a path forward. By 2016, Viktor Petrov's empire was at a crossroads. The war in Donbass had not only reshaped the political landscape but had also changed the nature of power in Ukraine and beyond. Petrov had managed to navigate the shifting allegiances, survive the economic sanctions, and maintain his position at the heart of the conflict. But the world was changing rapidly, and Petrov knew that in order to secure his future, he would have to adapt in ways he had never anticipated. The war, which had once seemed like an opportunity for Petrov to expand his empire, had taken a toll on the very industries he had worked so hard to control. The steel mills and coal mines of Donbass, once lucrative assets that fueled his wealth, were now at risk of being destroyed in the crossfire. The region was becoming increasingly unstable, and even Petrov's considerable resources could not shield him from the widespread destruction. For the first time in years, Petrov felt the walls closing in on him. His access to key resources was being threatened, and his political alliances, once so reliable, were starting to fray. In response to the growing threats, Petrov began to shift his focus. He understood that his empire could not survive on industrial resources alone. The key to his continued survival would lie in diversifying his holdings and forging new alliances, ones that could offer him protection and leverage in the face of the ongoing conflict. Petrov's ability to think several steps ahead had always been his greatest strength, and now, more than ever, he needed to rely on that skill. Petrov began to explore new avenues for power, turning his attention to the burgeoning energy sector. Ukraine's energy infrastructure was a critical lifeline for the country, and control of it meant not just wealth, but influence over the government's ability to function. Petrov, ever the opportunist, saw the potential in this sector and began making strategic moves to secure his position. He worked to establish ties with key figures in Ukraine's energy industry, using his network of loyalists and business contacts to acquire stakes in power plants and oil refineries. His connections to Russian energy giants also proved invaluable, as he began brokering deals that allowed him to control the flow of natural gas into Ukraine. The energy sector, Petrov realized, could be the new cornerstone of his empire. But as Petrov expanded into new industries, he found that his past was never far behind him. His reputation as a shadowy figure in the underworld, a man whose wealth had been built on illegal activities, continued to haunt him. The Ukrainian government, under increasing pressure from the West to clamp down on corruption, had begun to turn its attention to the oligarchs who had long controlled the country's resources. Petrov, who had once operated with impunity, now found himself at the center of investigations into his business dealings. The authorities were closing in, and Petrov knew it was only a matter of time before his empire would come under direct attack. As the Ukrainian government ramped up its efforts to root out corruption, Petrov faced an existential threat. He had always been able to rely on his political connections to stay one step ahead of the law, but the changing political climate made those relationships increasingly tenuous. In 2016, the Ukrainian government passed a series of sweeping anti-corruption reforms that targeted the very oligarchs who had once been pillars of the system. These reforms were championed by President Petro Poroshenko, who was determined to align Ukraine with the West and present a more transparent face to the international community. Petrov, whose power had been built on secrecy and illicit deals, found himself squarely in the crosshairs. In an attempt to protect himself, Petrov began to distance himself from some of his more controversial business dealings. He publicly disavowed his ties to the separatists in Donbass and began to downplay his connections to Russia. At the same time, he quietly continued to pull the strings behind the scenes, working to secure his financial interests while maintaining a lower profile. Petrov's ability to operate in the shadows had always been one of his greatest assets, and now he would need to rely on that skill more than ever. Despite his efforts to distance himself from his past, Petrov's name continued to be associated with the darker side of Ukraine's political and criminal underworld. His role in the Donbass conflict, his ties to Russian intelligence, and his involvement in various illicit businesses made him a target for both the Ukrainian authorities and international law enforcement. As Petrov tried to reposition himself as a legitimate businessman, he realized that his past actions could no longer be ignored. The ghosts of his past had a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient times. Petrov's efforts to lay low were further complicated by the changing dynamics within Russia itself. In 2016, the Kremlin's influence over Ukraine was at its peak, but internally, Russia was grappling with its own challenges. The economic sanctions imposed by the West were beginning to take their toll on the Russian economy, and there was growing dissatisfaction among the Russian public. Putin's control over the country was being tested, and some of the oligarchs who had once been loyal to him were beginning to question the wisdom of aligning themselves so closely with the Kremlin's policies. Petrov, always one to read the political winds, knew that his continued reliance on Moscow could become a liability. In response, Petrov began to diversify his alliances. While he maintained his connections to Russian officials, he also sought out new opportunities for collaboration with the West. He made discreet overtures to Western businesses, offering them access to Ukraine's industrial and energy sectors in exchange for their protection from the Ukrainian government's anti-corruption efforts. At the same time, he worked to deepen his ties to influential figures in the European Union, hoping to position himself as a key player in the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war. Petrov's ability to play both sides of the geopolitical divide was a testament to his cunning and adaptability. He understood that survival in the modern world of global politics required more than just brute force, it required the ability to navigate a complex web of relationships, to exploit every opening, and to anticipate the next move. But even as he continued to expand his reach, Petrov knew that his time in the shadows was running out. The world was watching, and he would soon have to decide whether to continue playing the game or face the consequences of his past actions. As Viktor Petrov moved into the later part of 2016, his position had become increasingly delicate. Though he had skillfully avoided the full brunt of Ukraine's anti-corruption reforms and managed to hold on to his interests in energy and industrial sectors, he was still far from untouchable. The new government in Kiev, while focused on distancing itself from the old oligarchic system, had not abandoned its efforts to root out corruption at all levels. Petrov's name, whispered in the shadowy corners of both Ukrainian politics and international business, was becoming too well known, too dangerous. Every step he took was under scrutiny, and every deal he brokered had consequences far beyond his immediate circle of influence. In the fall of 2016, things took an unexpected turn. Petrov's relationship with the Russian government, always a key pillar of his empire, began to show cracks. Vladimir Putin's grip on power, while seemingly unshaken, was beginning to show signs of strain as Russia faced mounting economic difficulties from the West's sanctions. In Ukraine, Petrov's ties to the Kremlin had become a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the Russian government had long seen him as an ally, a reliable conduit through which they could channel influence into Ukraine and the larger post-Soviet space. On the other hand, as Ukraine increasingly pivoted towards the West, maintaining a visible connection to Russian-backed oligarchs like Petrov was becoming a liability. Petrov realized that the winds of change were blowing fiercely. If he wanted to survive, let alone thrive, in this new geopolitical landscape, he would need to reconsider his strategy. His connections in Moscow, which had served him so well in the past, were no longer enough. His future in Ukraine, and perhaps even his life, could depend on how he navigated these shifting allegiances. At the same time, Petrov's empire was facing growing internal challenges. His once-iron grip on Donbass, which had allowed him to control key industries and act as a power broker in the region, was weakening. The war in the east had escalated, and as the Ukrainian army gained ground in the region, the separatists, with whom Petrov had aligned himself, found themselves on the back foot. The control of crucial industrial zones was slipping away, and with it, Petrov's hold over the lucrative coal and steel markets. As his assets in the region dwindled, so too did his influence over the political apparatus in Kiev. The game was changing, and Petrov had to adapt. In response to these new realities, Petrov began to diversify his operations more aggressively. Recognizing the importance of global finance, he sought to expand his network of connections in international business and finance. He began to court wealthy investors from the Middle East and Europe, promising them access to Ukraine's energy resources, its strategic location, and its rich natural resources. To these investors, Petrov offered a chance to gain a foothold in a country on the edge of Europe, where the geopolitical tug-of-war between East and West was intensifying. One of the key sectors he turned to was agriculture. Ukraine, with its fertile soil and vast stretches of farmland, had long been known as the breadbasket of Europe. In the wake of the war, much of the country's agricultural output had become vulnerable, but the opportunity for Petrov was clear. By consolidating control over key agricultural assets, particularly in the fertile southern and central regions, Petrov could both feed his empire and gain new leverage over the government in Kiev. The food supply was a powerful tool, and controlling it meant controlling the population. Yet, even as Petrov expanded his interests in agriculture and secured deals with new investors, the pressure from Ukrainian law enforcement and Western intelligence agencies intensified. The tactics he had relied on in the past, bribery, coercion, and backroom deals, were no longer enough to keep his empire intact. Petrov needed to develop new strategies to preserve his position. It was becoming increasingly clear that his old ways of doing business, built on loyalty to the Kremlin and power in the shadows, were no longer sustainable. Petrov's response to this changing environment was to begin cultivating new allies within Ukraine. Recognizing that the new government was driven by a desire for reform and transparency, he made a calculated decision to play the role of a new oligarch, one who was willing to align himself with Kiev's reform agenda. Publicly, Petrov began to distance himself from his more controversial past, positioning himself as a legitimate businessman with a vision for the future. He emphasized his commitment to Ukraine's economic development, his belief in the country's European future, and his desire to help rebuild the war-torn regions of Donbass. To bolster this image, Petrov began to make strategic public donations to charity and humanitarian causes, presenting himself as a philanthropist who was genuinely concerned about Ukraine's future. Behind the scenes, however, he continued to operate in the shadows, using his wealth and influence to manipulate the levers of power. He remained a player in the energy sector, a key figure in agricultural exports, and a shadowy benefactor to various political factions. Yet, despite his efforts to reinvent himself, the past continued to haunt him. Western intelligence agencies were closing in on his illicit activities, and several of his business dealings were under investigation. Petrov's empire was no longer immune from scrutiny, and he found himself facing potential criminal charges in both Ukraine and the West. The once untouchable oligarch was now a target. In response to this mounting pressure, Petrov turned to his old allies in Moscow. Despite the Kremlin's own internal struggles, they remained a powerful force. Petrov knew that his connections to Russia were still a valuable bargaining chip. In secret meetings with high-ranking officials in Moscow, Petrov offered to broker a deal that would see his assets, including those in the energy and agricultural sectors, aligned with Russian interests. In exchange, he sought protection from the growing pressure in Ukraine and the West. His position, precarious as it was not beyond redemption, but it would require careful maneuvering and the right alliances. As 2017 approached, Petrov's options were narrowing. He could no longer rely on the Kremlin's backing as unconditionally as he once had. The shifting political realities, both in Ukraine and in Russia, were making it increasingly difficult for him to maintain his position at the top. But Viktor Petrov was nothing if not resourceful. He had weathered storms before, and he knew that the key to his survival lay in adapting once more. But in order to stay ahead, he would have to make choices that would either solidify his position or bring about his ultimate downfall. Every move was a gamble, one that could either pave the way for greater influence or lead to his destruction. Petrov knew that in a world of shifting allegiances and political chaos, survival required both patience and cunning. He was already planning his next steps, understanding that the stakes had never been higher. By the end of 2017, Viktor Petrov had managed to weather the political storm in Ukraine, but the cost of survival was steep. His empire, once firmly rooted in the coal mines of Donbass and the steel mills of eastern Ukraine, had shifted focus, embracing new sectors like agriculture, energy, and international finance. But with these new ventures came new challenges, and as Petrov's wealth and influence grew, so too did the scrutiny that came with it. He had reinvented himself as a legitimate businessman, a supporter of Ukrainian economic reforms, and a philanthropist. But beneath the surface, his empire still operated in the shadows, and his past connections to Russia were never far from view. As Petrov navigated the complex world of international business, his fortunes remained tightly bound to the political developments within Ukraine and its relationship with Russia. Though he had distanced himself from the Kremlin in public, the ties that had once propelled him to power were difficult to sever entirely. The reality was that Petrov's success had always been tied to his ability to play both sides, to maintain connections in Moscow while also positioning himself as a key player in Ukraine's future. The Ukrainian government's efforts to reorient the country toward the West had forced Petrov to adapt, but his dependence on Russia was never something he could fully escape. The geopolitical tensions between the West and Russia, which had come to a head with the annexation of Crimea and the ongoing war in Donbass, had created a volatile environment for any businessman operating in the region. Petrov, like many of his peers, was caught in the middle. On one hand, he needed to maintain favorable relations with the Russian government in order to preserve his business interests. On the other, he had to keep up appearances with the Ukrainian authorities and international partners to avoid being blacklisted or sanctioned. In early 2018, as the conflict in eastern Ukraine raged on, Petrov found himself at a crossroads. Despite his efforts to distance himself from the separatists in Donbass, his past ties to the region remained a shadow over his empire. The international community, particularly the European Union and the United States, had placed heavy sanctions on Russian-backed entities operating in the conflict zones, and Petrov's name was on the radar. The Ukrainian government, under pressure from the West, began to ramp up its anti-corruption efforts, focusing on oligarchs like Petrov who were seen as obstacles to real reform. He was no longer the untouchable figure he had once been. The world was changing, and the walls were closing in. Yet Petrov was not one to back down from a challenge. He had always been a master of reinvention, and this time was no different. As sanctions tightened and investigations into his dealings continued, Petrov began to shift his focus once again. He understood that in order to survive, he needed to secure his future beyond the borders of Ukraine. To do so, he began to look outward, toward Europe and beyond, to build a global network that could offer him the protection he needed. Petrov's pivot toward Europe was not a simple move. It was a calculated strategy designed to distance himself from the increasingly unstable political climate in Ukraine and reduce his dependence on Moscow. His investments in agriculture, energy, and infrastructure were now part of a larger strategy to make himself indispensable to both Western investors and Ukrainian officials. Petrov reached out to influential figures in Europe, offering them access to Ukraine's resources in exchange for their support. He positioned himself as a conduit for European businesses seeking a foothold in Ukraine, all while maintaining his role as a power broker within Ukraine's political landscape. As Petrov's reputation began to shift in Europe, so did his dealings with Russia. He knew that his connection to Moscow, though complicated, remained valuable. In secret, Petrov continued to leverage his ties to Russian business elites, securing contracts for the import and export of Russian energy and industrial goods into Ukraine. This dual approach, playing both sides of the fence, allowed him to hedge his bets and ensure that his empire remained financially stable despite the increasing risks. By the middle of 2018, Petrov had successfully expanded his influence into the energy markets of Central and Eastern Europe. He brokered deals with European energy firms looking to tap into Ukraine's vast natural gas reserves and coal supplies, positioning himself as the key intermediary between Europe and the volatile region. These ventures not only provided him with new streams of income but also enhanced his stature in the international business community. But even as Petrov found success on the global stage, the political situation in Ukraine continued to evolve. The 2019 presidential election in Ukraine, which saw the rise of Volodymyr Zelensky, marked a new era for the country. Zelensky, a former comedian turned politician, ran on a platform of anti-corruption and government reform, promising to break the hold that oligarchs like Petrov had on the country's economy and political institutions. Petrov, ever the strategist, watched the election closely, knowing that the outcome would have a direct impact on his ability to maintain control. Zelensky's victory was a clear signal that the old guard of Ukrainian oligarchs was no longer as untouchable as they once had been. Petrov understood that if he was to survive under the new administration, he would need to adapt once again. He began to position himself as a reformer, publicly supporting Zelensky's anti-corruption efforts and promising to be a partner in Ukraine's modernization. Behind the scenes, however, he continued to pull strings, ensuring that his interests remained protected while maintaining a facade of compliance with the new government's reforms. Petrov's ability to adapt to shifting political realities had always been his greatest strength, but as the political and business landscape in Ukraine continued to change, his empire was forced to evolve in ways he had not anticipated. The rise of Zelensky and the increasing pressure from both the Ukrainian government and international bodies presented new challenges that Petrov could not ignore. Yet, for all the challenges he faced, Petrov knew that his empire was not yet at its end. He had weathered storms before, and he was prepared to do so again. In the face of these challenges, Petrov found himself reflecting on the legacy he was building. His rise to power had been shaped by his ability to navigate the shadows, to play both sides of the political divide, and to make the right alliances at the right time. But as he looked to the future, Petrov understood that the game was changing. The power he had once wielded from the shadows was now under the spotlight, and he would need to continue adapting if he hoped to remain relevant. As Viktor Petrov entered the latter half of 2019, the political landscape of Ukraine was shifting dramatically. The new president, Volodymyr Zelensky, had taken office with promises of sweeping reforms and a pledge to root out corruption, two pillars that had defined Petrov's life as an oligarch. The political dynamics that once played in Petrov's favor, his ability to operate behind the scenes, his connections to both Ukrainian and Russian power structures, were now under increasing scrutiny. The new administration had begun targeting the oligarchic system that had long controlled the country, and Petrov's name was inevitably caught in the crossfire. Despite his public persona as a legitimate businessman, Petrov had never completely severed his ties to the murky world of Ukrainian politics. His fortune had been built on the ability to pull strings from the shadows, leveraging both his business acumen and his influence over key figures in government and industry. For years, he had balanced the delicate act of aligning himself with whichever power was most advantageous at the time, whether it was the pro-Russian forces that dominated Ukraine's politics or the more pro-Western factions. Now, with Zelensky's government in power and the West pushing for greater accountability and transparency, Petrov's position was increasingly untenable. Yet Petrov, ever the strategist, understood that survival meant adapting. And adapt he did. Knowing that the political climate was turning against him, he began to shift his focus once more, this time aiming to expand his influence beyond Ukraine's borders. For Petrov, the key to surviving was not merely clinging to the past but reinventing himself for the future. Petrov's new strategy was twofold: diversify his business interests even further and solidify alliances with international partners who could offer him protection and opportunities in a rapidly changing world. One of his first moves was to deepen his involvement in the European energy market. Ukraine's energy sector had long been a point of contention, with Petrov playing a key role in its natural gas and oil industries. However, as the Ukrainian government pushed for reforms and sought to reduce its dependency on Russian energy supplies, Petrov saw an opportunity to diversify. He expanded his reach into European markets, negotiating deals with energy giants in Germany, Poland, and the Balkans. In doing so, Petrov was able to tap into a new vein of wealth while reducing his exposure to the unstable political environment within Ukraine. He positioned himself as a bridge between the East and the West, someone who understood the complexities of both regions and could navigate the delicate balance of interests between them. Petrov was not alone in recognizing the potential of Ukraine's energy market, but his deep ties to key players in the Russian and Ukrainian energy sectors gave him an edge. He offered European companies access to energy resources that were otherwise difficult to secure, and in return, he gained the influence necessary to protect his business empire from both Ukrainian and Russian interference. Yet even as Petrov expanded his energy holdings, the political pressure at home continued to mount. The new government's aggressive stance on corruption began to hit closer to home. Petrov's associates in the government, once his allies, were now facing investigations and criminal charges. It was clear that Zelensky's administration had no intention of allowing the oligarchs to continue to pull the strings behind the scenes. The oligarchs had long been the puppet masters of Ukraine's politics, but with the push for reform, their power was beginning to wane. In response to these threats, Petrov began to consolidate his power within Ukraine in more covert ways. He worked to strengthen his influence over regional political figures, many of whom were still aligned with his old patronage networks. Petrov also began to quietly finance political campaigns, using his vast network of contacts to ensure that key regions remained under the control of his allies. He understood that in a country where loyalty could be bought and sold, maintaining a political edge was critical for survival. And so, he began to pull strings behind the scenes, ensuring that the political machinery that had once supported him continued to operate in his favor, even if it had to be done under the radar. But Petrov was not just focused on consolidating power within Ukraine. He also sought to expand his global reach, taking advantage of the growing political and economic uncertainty in Europe and beyond. As Ukraine's political future remained in flux, Petrov recognized that opportunities in other parts of the world were beginning to emerge. He turned his attention to Africa, where he saw significant potential in the continent's burgeoning natural resource markets. Over the past decade, African countries had become increasingly attractive to investors seeking access to untapped mineral wealth, oil, and gas reserves. Petrov, always one to spot an opportunity, began to make discreet inroads into African markets, securing mining contracts and energy deals with governments across the continent. These new ventures in Africa not only provided Petrov with access to new sources of wealth, but they also helped insulate him from the growing political pressure back home. By diversifying his portfolio and establishing a presence in Africa, Petrov ensured that his financial interests were spread across multiple regions, reducing his dependence on the volatile Ukrainian market. It also served as a hedge against the political instability in Ukraine, should the situation there deteriorate further. However, as he expanded his global empire, Petrov was aware that the risks of his actions were growing. His involvement in the African market, while profitable, exposed him to new risks, including the possibility of running afoul of international sanctions. His historical ties to Russia made him an easy target for Western authorities who were keen to crack down on any individuals with close ties to the Kremlin. As a result, Petrov found himself walking a fine line, carefully managing his business dealings to avoid attracting too much attention while simultaneously expanding his empire. But Petrov's ability to navigate these complex geopolitical landscapes was not without its consequences. The more he expanded, the more he was pulled into the web of international intrigue. His network of contacts, built over years of navigating the corridors of power in Ukraine, Russia, and beyond, was beginning to draw the attention of intelligence agencies around the world. Petrov knew that in the world he inhabited, information was power, and the more powerful enemies he made, the greater the risks to his continued survival. Despite the mounting pressure, Petrov remained calm and focused. His years of experience in the shadows had taught him the art of patience. He knew that in times of crisis, it was essential to remain adaptable and flexible, ready to change course at a moment's notice. But even as he continued to play his complex game of geopolitical chess, Petrov was keenly aware of the fragility of his position. His empire, built on years of careful manipulation and secrecy, was now under threat from all sides. The question remained, could he continue to adapt to the ever-changing landscape, or would his past finally catch up with him? As 2020 approached, Viktor Petrov found himself standing at the crossroads of his empire. The political forces within Ukraine were shifting again, and his hold on power, both within the country and beyond its borders, was increasingly precarious. But one thing was certain, Viktor Petrov was not a man who would go down without a fight. The final chapters of his story were yet to be written, and for the first time in years, the future of his empire hung in the balance. As Viktor Petrov faced the growing storm of political unrest in Ukraine, he realized that the only way to secure his position was to control his narrative. The political winds were changing rapidly under President Volodymyr Zelensky's leadership, and the once invincible oligarchs like Petrov were now becoming targets of the new anti-corruption drive. For years, he had been untouchable, his wealth and influence cemented by strategic alliances and a tight grip on key industries like energy, agriculture, and defense. But the past few years had seen the ground shift beneath his feet. Zelensky's administration had promised to break the oligarchic stranglehold on Ukraine's economy and government, and Petrov was increasingly finding himself in the crosshairs. With the reformist momentum gathering steam, Petrov knew that his survival depended on his ability to pivot, to manage his empire from the shadows while presenting a more palatable face to the public. His ability to remain relevant in a world that was rapidly changing was a testament to his adaptability, and now, more than ever, he needed to demonstrate that he was a man of the future, not the past. Petrov's world had always been one of fine lines and blurred boundaries. He was an oligarch, yes, but also a businessman, a political player, and an essential figure in Ukraine's complex socio-economic landscape. Now, as his influence in Ukraine waned, he sought ways to ensure his legacy wasn't erased by the very forces he had once manipulated. Despite his careful efforts to cultivate a more positive public image, Petrov's past was never far behind him. He had made enemies over the years, not just among political rivals, but also among those within his own business empire who had been willing to use ruthless methods to further their ambitions. Petrov's own rise to power had been characterized by bloodshed, betrayals, and dark dealings. As much as he tried to reinvent himself as a legitimate businessman, the shadows of his past continued to haunt him. And with increasing pressure from the West, his connections to the Russian political and business elite came under close scrutiny. Western governments, particularly in the European Union and the United States, had started to target figures like Petrov, who were seen as too close to Vladimir Putin's regime. It wasn't just the international community that was closing in on Petrov. Domestically, the tide had turned against him as well. Zelensky's crackdown on corruption was beginning to have real consequences for the oligarchs who had long controlled Ukraine's political machinery. Petrov's old allies in government were being purged, and a new breed of politicians was rising to prominence, eager to dismantle the power structures that had kept men like him at the top. What had once been a carefully choreographed dance between Petrov and Ukrainian politicians was now a full-on battle for survival. The era of unchecked influence and wealth accumulation was coming to an end, and Petrov had to figure out how to navigate this new, dangerous terrain. Petrov understood that the key to survival in this new environment was diversification. His traditional sources of income, energy, steel, and agriculture, were no longer as profitable or as secure as they once had been. His control over Ukraine's energy infrastructure, while still substantial, was increasingly threatened by new political realities. The energy sector, long a playground for oligarchs, was undergoing a transformation, with the Ukrainian government pushing for reforms that would limit the control of private individuals over critical national resources. In the face of these reforms, Petrov began to invest heavily in new industries, both within Ukraine and abroad, trying to position himself as an essential player in emerging markets. One of the key areas Petrov turned his attention to was the tech industry. While he had no formal background in technology or innovation, he saw an opportunity to capitalize on the growing tech scene in Ukraine. The country had been positioning itself as a growing hub for tech startups, with a burgeoning scene of developers, entrepreneurs, and investors beginning to take notice. As Viktor Petrov's empire shifted into new sectors, the personal toll of his actions became ever more evident. Despite his immense wealth and influence, there was a growing sense of isolation in his life. The very mechanisms that had allowed him to rise to the top, ruthless decision-making, strategic alliances, and an ever-watchful eye on the horizon, were now working against him. His paranoia, which had always been a silent companion, began to creep to the surface more frequently. Petrov had spent decades building his empire, but with the threats to his power growing by the day, he began to question whether the price of his ambition had been too high. The sudden collapse of several key allies in Ukraine, who had once been loyal and trusted figures, left Petrov vulnerable in ways he hadn't anticipated. These individuals, men he had mentored, who had benefited from his guidance, began to fall, one after another, either imprisoned or fleeing the country in disgrace. Petrov, ever the strategist, had known that the political winds would shift, but the speed with which the new government moved to dismantle the old guard surprised even him. What had once seemed like a careful game of power was now slipping through his fingers like sand. He began to retreat into his safe spaces, his lavish estates, his private planes, and the shadowy corners of his network where he could remain unseen by prying eyes. His growing isolation was not just physical but emotional. The years of backroom deals, the betrayals, and the constant need to outmaneuver rivals had left him with few genuine connections. Petrov's closest confidants had always been loyal, but as the political environment in Ukraine shifted and old allegiances fractured, he found himself with fewer and fewer allies he could truly trust. Even those who remained loyal to him now seemed to question whether he had become too entrenched in his own ways. The political and personal isolation Petrov felt was compounded by a deepening sense of insecurity. His once unassailable control over Ukraine's energy sector, which had been his crown jewel for years, was now under siege. As the government moved forward with its reforms, and the country increasingly aligned itself with the West, Petrov's ties to Russia became a liability. While he had maintained his strategic relationships with Russian power players, the ever-watchful eye of the European Union and the United States meant that his connections to the Kremlin were a constant threat to his business interests. He realized that being seen as too close to Moscow could result in sanctions, which would cripple his operations and potentially destroy the wealth he had spent so many years accumulating. Desperation led Petrov to lean more heavily on his international ventures. He looked to the Balkans, Africa, and the Middle East as potential safe havens for his financial activities. Yet, no matter where he turned, he found that the geopolitical world was becoming increasingly interconnected and transparent. The cozy, behind-the-scenes deals that once defined his dealings were being exposed by watchdogs, journalists, and a growing network of intelligence agencies. Petrov had built his empire on discretion, and now that very discretion was being chipped away by a combination of investigative efforts and the digital age's ever-expanding reach. The world was growing smaller, and Petrov's carefully constructed web of influence was becoming harder to maintain. His focus shifted from creating new opportunities to preserving the ones he already had. The pressure of the collapsing political and business environment took a toll on Petrov's health. His once robust figure seemed to shrink with each passing month, and those who knew him well began to notice a nervous edge in his demeanor. The private dinners with high-ranking officials, the late-night meetings in dimly lit boardrooms, and the endless series of phone calls to distant allies no longer brought him the same sense of satisfaction. They were now just obligations, reminders of how far he had come, and how close he was to losing it all. Despite the mounting pressures, Petrov remained calculated in his actions. Even as he began to take fewer risks in the public eye, he continued to play the game behind the scenes. His empire had grown vast, spanning multiple industries and continents, and it was not easy to dismantle. But the cracks in his operation were undeniable. Petrov could see the writing on the wall, his days of unchecked power were coming to an end. In private, he began to contemplate his legacy. Petrov had always prided himself on building something that would outlast him. He had envisioned his name etched in the annals of Ukrainian history, his fortune securing a future for generations to come. But as the new political climate in Ukraine took hold, and his former allies disappeared into obscurity, Petrov began to wonder if all his efforts would simply be erased. Would his empire crumble under the weight of reform, or would he find a way to endure, to survive once more? Petrov's thoughts often turned to his family, those closest to him, who had been with him through thick and thin. He had raised his children in a world of luxury and power, and they had always known their father as a man who could get anything he wanted. But as the walls closed in around him, he questioned what kind of future he was leaving for them. His children, once eager to follow in his footsteps, had begun to distance themselves. They had seen the danger of their father's world, and some had started to seek lives away from the limelight, from the dangerous undercurrents of power and corruption that had shaped Petrov's rise. For the first time in years, Petrov felt vulnerable. His empire, which had once seemed invincible, was now teetering on the edge. The looming threats from both within and outside Ukraine were undeniable. His empire, built on power and secrecy, was crumbling under the weight of the very reforms he had once been able to manipulate. His legacy, once a shining monument to his ambition, was now in danger of being reduced to a footnote in history. In the face of these realities, Petrov faced a choice: either double down on his dwindling power and continue to play a dangerous game, or step away and secure what he could from the wreckage of his empire. The world had changed, and Viktor Petrov's ability to adapt once again stood as the key to his survival.